So, good or bad, telling the difference is hard. Being a programmer is mostly about drinking coffee, Googling answers on Stack Overflow, and making choices. Choices include which frameworks to use, what libraries to use, and how code should be written. And I'm hoping, when you're making those choices, you're choosing which framework's good, which ones are bad, which library is good, which are bad, and what code would be good and what would be bad. So a huge chunk of being a programmer is what is good, what is bad. But what if we're just not very good at this skill? What if we're all actually kind of terrible at it and don't realise it? How can we learn to be better at telling the difference between good and bad? And what can we do when we aren't that good at it? So before we talk about software, let's talk about something that should be easier. Something you hold in your hand that you should be able to tell if it's good or bad or not. Everyone shout out, what is this device?
It says it on the screen.
Oh yeah, it does, but it also says artist, so it could be an artist. Shut up, Joes. Does anybody remember how the iPod was received when it first came out? Did people think it was good? Or people think it was bad, or kind of in between? It actually wasn't received that well. When it came out, you're very right. When it came out, it was about $200 more than the next most expensive MP3 player. It didn't have that much space, didn't have wireless. People just thought it wasn't that good and overpriced. So how did the iPod sell? Sold not too bad, actually. One iPod for approximately every 12 people on the planet, which is a pretty decent result. Who remembers this? It is, of course, an iPhone. I'd learnt my lesson a little bit. I didn't think the iPod was going to be a success. I thought the iPhone was going to be a bit more of a success. Maybe Apple might get as much as 20% of the market. Who knows? But even for the iPhone, when that came out, this is such a great quote, I have to read it out. This is from Steve Ballmer, Microsoft CEO at the time. Not exactly a neutral person, but there's no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share. No chance. It's a $500 subsidized item. They may make a lot of money, but blah, blah, blah. I'd prefer to have our software in 60, 70 or 80% of the phones than I would to have 2 or 3%, which is what Apple might get. So, how did the iPhone sell? It sold pretty well. 1.2 billion iPhones sold so far, 700 billion in revenue. But those numbers are pretty impressive by themselves. But more impressive to me is that for the past couple of years, Apple have been taking approximately 90% of the profit that's to be had in selling mobile phones. They get 90%. Every other mobile phone maker is either losing money or just having a teeny tiny profit. This is actually causing an interesting effect where Apple just have way more money to invest in R&D than everybody else. So their CPUs are getting faster than everybody else's. The materials they're making their phones out of is getting better, and that's going to leave them selling more phones for at least the next couple of years. So I'd like to explain why I'm giving this talk. The iPhone came out. It was selling really well. There are still people who just thought that the iPhone just wasn't that good. And they had decent points. It doesn't have a replaceable battery, can't put a memory card in it, it didn't have NMS at launch. And there's lots of people I talked to online who thought it was unfair that the Apple iPhone was selling as well as it should do. And a lot of these people weren't exactly calm and reasonable about their objections. They thought it was unfair that this device that wasn't this good, that wasn't so good, was selling well. I thought this was a really interesting observation that the iPhone was out, it was selling really well, and there are still people out there who thought it wasn't that good, and it shouldn't be selling as well. And so if you take nothing else away from this talk, I'd like you to take this away. If you think something is bad, but it's hugely popular, it's probably you that's got the problem in being able to tell the difference from good from bad. It's not anybody else's fault, and you shouldn't try and change everybody else's mind on the planet. Just maybe you don't understand it, but just move on and just like accept that something's popular, even though you're not sure why. So, getting back to software, I think there's two things that really make it difficult to tell whether stuff is good or bad when it comes to software. There's emotions, and there's the fact that math is hard. So first of all, emotions. Programmers, or most programmers, like to think we're logical people and we make decisions based on logic. It's not true. We're all human and we've all got emotions. It's just that some people choose to ignore those emotions or pretend that they don't have them. At one company I worked at, we were doing some research on what technology we should use for the next project that was coming up. And one of the senior programmers there, basically he'd gotten bored of his job. He was using the same technology. He'd been using the same technology for the past couple of years. He'd just gotten bored with just writing bits of PHP code and connecting it up to MySQL. And he found out about a piece of software called Neo4j, which is a Java-based graph data storage. It's really cool. It's completely overkill for the project. But he was saying, we should use Neo4j. It's fast. And, okay, do we need to go fast? And we then did some analysis of exactly what the business requirements were for this project. And his argument was, we should use Neo4j. We can do 10,000 requests a second. And we did the analysis, and it turned out that we really needed to be able to serve about 1 request per second. Maybe like 2 at our busy times. But he was committed to Neo4j. It was only when we got to the $10,000 price tag that he realized that maybe it wasn't such a good idea. But this is a common mistake that programmers make. We confuse our own emotions about what technology we should be using, and think instead of choosing a boring thing, we want to have something new and fun and exciting. If you've got a choice of technologies, always choose, or not always, but it's quite likely to be the right choice to use the one that's most boring whenever possible. I know it's not going to satisfy your soul for learning new things, but from a business perspective, a known technology that you know works, that the admins know how to admin, is going to be a better choice than a new thing where you've got to learn how it works. So next, emotion. Which of these is better? And I'm deliberately vague question. Which of these is better? Code that is easy to understand, has a good design, and has a good number of unit tests. Or, alternatively, code that is rough around the edges, is full of hacks, and isn't fully tested. Hands up for the first one. Hands up for the second one. Okay. Room full of people with no opinions.
Which one solves the business problem?
Ah, there you go. Yes, James is correct. This is a trick question. That question is based on aesthetics, not based on logic. Without information like cost, time taken, the one that fits the business need, the one that works properly, or maybe not, you can't actually tell which of those pieces of code is actually going to be better. However, you can answer that question based on aesthetics. Which one would you like to work with most? Pretty obviously, most people would prefer to work with clean code where possible. People come with a fixed set of aesthetics, things that they're naturally attracted to. And sometimes it's quite hard to change these things. But you can learn. You can learn new aesthetics. It's something you've got to put your mind to. And once you can understand a new aesthetic, a new way of looking at a thing, and determining if it's beautiful or not. You can then appreciate it on that level instead of just what you're naturally attracted to. So, first new aesthetic for the evening. Does anybody speak Japanese here? No, cool. This is kintsugi, which I'm definitely pronouncing correctly. Kintsugi is a art form or set of aesthetics where items, particularly pottery, they've been broken and they're repaired. They're repaired using gold or silver or other fine materials. And the repair work is not hidden away. The repair work is done in a way to emphasize this is an object that was whole to begin with and it broke and we've now repaired it. And in the aesthetic, it highlights that an object doesn't just exist in perfect state. This object has a history, and that an object that's had a history where it's been used, where it's been broken, where it's been repaired, is in the aesthetic is a more interesting and beautiful object than an item that just has never been used to begin with. I'm pretty sure none of our code bases are perfect. Quite a few code bases, particularly when you've had to merge two applications, there's going to be cracks and joins between the two of them. And that just means that the application's been used in the past, as opposed to perfect applications that have never been used. As once you begin to be able to see imperfections in that way, you can begin to appreciate it and not just think that all code should be perfect for always. There's a second similarly related aesthetic called wabi-sabi, also from Japan. In Western culture, we're naturally attracted to things that are perfect, pristine, delicate, and expensive. If I asked people, and they answered, which of these teapots is more attractive, most people in Western society would say the fine china teapot with a lovely painting and gold trim on it is a more aesthetically pleasing teapot. Wabi-sabi is a Japanese aesthetic centered on the acceptance of transience and imperfection. The teapot on the left is definitely not perfect. It's been used, it's got a bit of a rubbish straw handle, probably not going to last that long because once it gets wet, it might get damaged. The aesthetic is described as one of beauty that is imperfect, impermanent, and incomplete. Not all of our code has to be perfect. If you're writing, as James said, some code for a project that you know is only going to be used for 4 more weeks, there's no point making it the most perfect piece of software. Writing maybe you've got, if you're doing a project that's going to be only live for 4 weeks and you want to write a deployment script, just knock something out in Bash, and that'll probably be good enough for those 4 weeks. You don't need to build a Kubernetes cluster of things. Just get it on a server. And really it's about the fact that understanding that the code is not going to live forever. We're going to do something. It's not quite the same thing, but cheap and cheerful is another way of putting it. We're going to do something simple that works for now. I don't think I'm going to persuade anybody to fully dive into wabi-sabi in a talk, but it is interesting to note that it's derived from the Buddhist teachings of the 3 marks of existence: impermanence, suffering, and emptiness. And if that doesn't relate to quite a few software projects that people work on, I don't know what does. So, hang on. So the other main cause of people not being able to tell the difference between good and bad when it comes to software is that math is hard. I do mean math singular. I don't mean maths in general is hard, but I mean very specifically counting up numbers is hard. When we were hunter-gatherers, when we were hunter-gatherers, we'd have an apple in one hand, we'd have one apple. Get an apple in the other hand, that's two apples. We can cope with those numbers. If you asked a hunter-gatherer how many apples are there on a tree, I've only got two hands, so I can only carry two apples, so it's more than two. I don't have any links in the talk, but I'll provide some links later on. People just fundamentally struggle with numbers larger than two. I can give you. I'm not joking. I'll give you an example. Two examples. If I tell you a sad story about somebody dying from a horrible disease, you would feel sadness at this emotional level. If I tell you a story about two people dying from a horrible disease, you'd feel more sad, but maybe not twice as sad. If I tell you about 100,000 people in Africa dying of malaria each year, you don't feel as sad. You kind of don't register it at all. In fact, a story about one person has a much bigger emotional effect than a story about 100,000 people. The numbers just don't fit in our head. They go in, they just go out. There's no hardware in there to deal with numbers, starting with about more than two. Or as Stalin put it a bit more succinctly, one death is a tragedy, 10 million deaths is a statistic. This affects us in the business world. If you have to get approval for expenses, it's usually a bit of a pain to do that. If you're on a team and want to call a meeting with 10 people who are each cost the company $100 an hour, fine, sure, go for it. That's just $1,000 an hour. What's the worst that can happen? This difficulty in dealing with numbers leads to two things. We overvalue features and we undervalue ease of use. A feature is either there or it isn't. It's a 1 or a 0. Our brains can cope with that pretty well. If there's something that affects you or your users hundreds of times over the course of a project, your brain just can't cope with this mythical hundreds number. You just can't sum up the effect it would have. And so things that make life easier on a day-to-day basis in project are just really undervalued. So I'm going to show you that with some examples. There's some languages that are just crap. If you go to an expert and ask them, is this a good language or a bad language, they'll be able to give you a definitive answer and point out why something's bad. There's a language that everybody in this room is familiar with, I hope, that's pretty crap and somehow is widely used. Does anybody know the language I'm talking about? Say it again. No, somebody said it a moment ago. Yes. English is an objectively crap language. If you go to most people who study languages, they will complain about English being rubbish. Interestingly, in many of the same ways that computer science people complain about PHP being a bit rubbish. So, for example, English is hilariously inconsistent. You can understand it for the first one. All these words come from different places. They've got different pronunciations with them. Okay. The next one winds me up massively. It's the same word. Did you read it? Yes, I read it. It's the same word. It's got almost the same meaning, just a different tense, and it's pronounced differently. It's just not acceptable, really. That's another great quote, so I just had to leave it in there. Yeah, English is inconsistent just because it does nick vocabulary from other languages whenever possible. And PHP has a similar problem. If you look at the standard library from PHP, I mean, it's there, and you can use it. It's just really useful to have PHP.NET open in a browser or using an IDE that has it, does autocomplete for you. PHP keeps old bugs around and keeps backwards compatibility. Just because that's just one of the choices that's been made in the project. And English keeps old spellings around. It's like won't. What is the full word that won't is an abbreviation of? Vonot, I think. Vonot. But yeah, it's still rubbish anyway. Chumley is the first one. Somebody shout out how to pronounce the last word. It's bloody Fanshawe. I've got no idea how that happens. But no, this is the thing. People complain about PHP not breaking old bugs or not changing behaviours to be new and improved, and English does the same thing. English lacks features. Most European languages have a polite and informal way of saying you. So in French you can either say you as vous or tu. And that's great. It's a great feature. It allows you to show that you're being polite to somebody. Features are great, right? English doesn't have this feature. We used to have it, but then we used to have thee and thou were I believe, the impolite forms, but then they kind of just fell out of use during about the 16th century for not particularly clear reasons to me. Other languages have a feature where you can not just replace the you, but talk very deferentially and without being too direct. So instead of saying, yo, get me a drink, you'd hint at what your desire was. I'm very warm. I wonder if a refreshment would be nice. And the person who was listening to that sentence would say, would interpret it and say, right, they're thirsty, I get it. And PHP lacks features as well. So PHP lacks threads. I spent about 5 years, I don't think lectured is the right word, but working with Java developers who are always ragging on PHP for not having basic things like threads. And threads are great. They help solve. There's some problems that just you need threads to solve, so stuff like physics simulations or pathfinding. And if you've got them, they're great. And Ruby has a feature called monkey patching. So I don't actually use it myself, so I'll read out what it is from the slide. One of the most powerful aspects of Ruby is the ability to reopen any class and change its methods. Yes, that's right. You can actually reopen any class and change how it works. This includes the standard Ruby classes like string, array, or hash. So because PHP and English are rubbish, they lack features, they're terribly inconsistent, no one uses PHP anymore, and we're not having this talk in English. Let me correct that. 80% of the web powered by PHP, 1.5 billion people speak English, and it's the language used for business worldwide. As I said before, if you think something is bad, but it's hugely popular, you're failing to tell good from bad. Although people who study languages say that English and PHP are bad, and they've got valid points, those points are not invalid. They've obviously mistaken things that are important for things that are not important. So, lack of consistency. People think this is important to make a language be easy to use. When a language is highly consistent, it becomes quite difficult to introduce new ideas into it. The process for English acquiring a new word or a new phrase is, thanks, we've got that now, that's English. Other languages have language academies. Germany and France have language academies that look at how the language is changing, what people are looking for in new words, and then they'll try and make up new words to satisfy those needs. It takes a decade or two to get the changes to go through. And in Germany's case, it made lots of people very unhappy because not everybody agreed with the changes. As I said, English, we just grab them off the street, pretty much. And PHP is not consistent, but that means that it's been pretty easy for PHP to grow. PHP started off as a purely procedural language. It's grown to have classes, didn't always have exceptions. Pick those up along the way, and it's continuing to grow organically as it goes. So French 2 review. This is on my Twitter if you want a high-res version, which is twitter.com/Mr. Dan Ack. Basically, this is a short, simple diagram that shows whether you should use 2 or VU in different situations. So if you're an adult and you're talking to a child, you should probably use 2. Unless the child's a prince or something, then probably use VU instead. Apparently use 2 to talk to God if you want to do that. It's a pain. You can get it wrong, either deliberately or accidentally, and then you accidentally annoy the person. My dad retired to Normandy in France, and he's got a girlfriend. And one time I actually quite annoyed her because I'm not good at French. I find it much easier to just say s'il vous plaît, the polite form, all the time, rather than trying to think, should I be using s'il vous plaît or s'il te plaît in a conversation? And so I was using s'il vous plaît to be polite, and she saw this as me not accepting her into the family. This is the thing. In France, people have to ask, can we start toing each other now? Because we've known each other for like a few years, so we should. Can we too yet? Is it too soon? English doesn't have this. English lacks this feature, which means you can't deliberately be rude to somebody easily. We'll get there. So the languages that have deferential forms of speech and avoiding direct phrases, it's a feature. It doesn't really affect everyday life that much. It really affected Korean Air. Basically, what was happening from the start of the 80s until about 1997, Korean airplanes kept flying into mountains. What was happening was the senior captain was flying the plane. He was tired. The junior person who was more awake, because they just had a rest period, saw that the captain made a mistake, and instead of saying, "Hey, you've made a mistake," they would use a phrase that was very deferential and indirect. So one of the times the captain forgot to turn on the landing navigation system, and on the voice recorder, the co-pilot, the junior person, said, the last time we flew this route, the landing navigation system was very helpful to us. And because the captain was very tired, he just didn't think about what was said. He just blew it off, and then they just flew into a mountain. The junior person, don't laugh. The junior person saw the captain made a mistake, pointed it out, knew it was a very dangerous situation, but because of the social mores, I guess, of how they interacted, he just couldn't bring himself to say, "Oi, turn the navigation system on." English doesn't have this. This means that if you are at a conference and you want to talk to somebody, even if you don't know them very well, you can just go up to talk to them. You don't have to think, "Wow, that's a really good beard that guy has. I should be really deferential to him," or maybe that's a really stupid beard that guy has. I won't be deferential to him. In English, you just go up and talk to people. It's pretty hard to give offence accidentally. Just in case anybody's not aware, I think these are... Never use these phrases. They're about the only way, or they're the only ways I could think of to accidentally give offence to people.
I see you next Tuesday, that's
Okay, so moving on. So PHP lacks threads. I have done some Java programming and I've worked with Java programming. Not having threads in a language makes everything be so much simpler. If you've got threads present, you need to make sure that all of your code is either thread aware or just safe to be called multiple times. It's a massive, massive pain in the butt. Although it's a nice feature, not having it makes PHP a lot simpler. And PHP lacks monkey patching. So this is an actual example of some monkey patching going on. So this is Ruby, where it's doing 4 divided by 3. Just by itself, that gives a result of 1, and the result is of type fixed num. You can bring in this library called mathen, and then you do the same operation, 4 divided by 3, and the result is a rational number, a fraction of 4 divided by 3, and the type's changed. So instead of 1, you've got a fraction of 4 over 3. PHP doesn't have this feature, tragically. This means that we're stuck having deterministic behavior of the basic maths operations in the code, which turns out to be quite nice. On a day-to-day thing, you don't need to think, what is this divide operation going to do? So, in general, features generally make things harder to use, and things that affect everyday use accumulate, but we're just bad at processing them just because we're bad at math. So I want to close the loop that I left open earlier. Why was the iPod so successful? There's 2 reasons. iTunes is not a good piece of software. I just want to be clear about that. No, leave no doubt on the table. It's a terrible piece of software, but it was good enough and it was easy enough. Before iTunes came out, or for at least most of the existing MP3 players, you'd have one bit of software to rip a CD, and you'd have a separate bit of software for uploading the MP3s to your MP3 player. iTunes was the first bit of software where you could plug in the iPod, put in a CD, click rip in one step, and the music would be on your MP3 player a few minutes later, which just made getting music onto the iPod be a lot easier. But the main reason is the wheel interface. It's one of the greatest pieces of design, of UX design that's probably ever existed, in my opinion. So the problem was, before the wheel came along, imagine you've got 500 albums on your non-iPod MP3 player, and you're at the start of the list of albums, and you've got a button to go to the next album. If you've got 500 albums, you've got to press that button 499 times to get to the last album. With the wheel, you just start spinning it and it accelerates, and it means that for people with large music collections, which kind of tend to be the people who can afford expensive MP3 players, that it allows them to actually be able to play their music on the device. And similarly, why was the iPhone a success when not everybody thought it was going to be? So first of all, Nokia had to screw up massively. This is another great quote that I'll read out. So this is from a guy called John Dvorak, who was paid money for his opinions about things. Apple should pull the plug on the iPhone. This is not an this is in 2007, just before it launched. This is not an emerging business. In fact, it's gone so far that it's in the process of consolidation, with probably 2 players dominating everything, Nokia and Motorola. These phones go in and out of style so fast that unless Apple has half a dozen variants in the pipeline, its phone, even if immediately successful, will be passé within 3 months. there is no likelihood that Apple can be successful in a business this competitive. At the time, people thought phones were fashion accessories, that people buying phones were always looking for the new thing, and once a phone had become a few months old, it was no longer fashionable, and so people would be looking to replace it with a newer, more up-to-date handset. This is a list of all the iPhone models that have been released in the past 10 years. This is the list of models that Nokia launched in just 2007. So it's 18 iPhones, I think, over the past 10 years versus 53 different Nokia models in just 2007. Nokia thought giving customers choice of which handset they wanted was a good thing, and it's a feature. It's a feature of choice. It's got a real massive downside though. If you're in 2007, you walked into a store and said, "I'd like an iPhone," if they had any in stock, they'd say, "Yes, here's your iPhone." If you walked into a store and said, "I'd like the latest Nokia," or I'd like an up-to-date Nokia, they'd say, "Right, which of these 53 phones would you like?" What that resulted in is people just spending an hour or so trying to figure out which phone they wanted, not being able to figure out which device they actually wanted, and then walking out of the store without buying anything. The fewer choices you can give people, the better. So Nokia fucked up, and then so why was the iPhone actually successful? Apple made some really good choices. At the time, Apple didn't have a huge engineering team. Although the iPod had been a success, the previous decade had been quite difficult for Apple, and they just didn't have that many employees in their engineering team, which really limited the amount of stuff that they could work on. They knew that they wouldn't be able to implement all of the features that people expected in a good way, so they deliberately chose to leave out stuff that we would take as necessary for a phone. So there's no copy and paste, there's no MMS, and there's lots of other features that they left out. They also really simplified the interface. An iPhone has 3 buttons, but most of the time you only press the home button. I did a count on my trusty Sony Ericsson K800, which I thought was clearly superior to the iPhone when it came out. It's got 9 buttons plus a 5-way nipple on it. The iPhone is just way easier to use. And all of the engineering effort that they didn't put into making features, they spent on one thing: making the scrolling smooth for the screen. So you're in a browser, scrolling away. All of the iPhones have been pretty smooth on scrolling. That took up a huge amount of engineering effort. They had to rewrite Safari from the desktop version to be able to run on a CPU in an iPhone. They had to tweak the or basically write an operating system from scratch that could run on a very low power CPU, but still be able to interact with it or accept input from the user rapidly. They spent a huge amount of effort on that. And the thing is, you don't really think, hey, smooth scrolling is that important a feature. It's a thing that's there, and as long as it's smooth, you pretty much don't notice it. But from about up until, say, 2011, it was something that all of the Android phones struggled with. You get an Android phone, go to a website, start scrolling, and it would jank. It would just either it wouldn't respond to the touch, or it would just stop halfway through. And that's the thing that makes using it be not easy. You're always having to think, oh, is it stopped because I didn't touch it, or is it stopped because it's not responding? Having the interface be really easy to use really made the iPhone be a good product that people wanted to buy. So, what can we do? What can we do to get better at telling good from bad? recognize your own emotions, push back against features, put all the effort that you saved in not making new features into making life easy for either your users or your developers as well. This is something I screwed up on my last project. Project was using Docker, and we didn't have a container that was running Xdebug in it. That meant that every time we wanted to debug something, we had to stop the container, go and edit a Docker file to make Xdebug be loaded, restart the containers, and then get back to actually debugging the thing that we wanted to debug. Pretty obviously, that just means that we just didn't use debugging that much. There's a whole load of var dump debugging going on, which is not what James approves of at all. But more subtly, be prepared to still be wrong. No matter how good you are at making choices between good and bad, there's still going to be cases where you just get it wrong. So, if you choose to use a particular framework and that choice is wrong, if you decouple your code from the framework, you'll be able to replace the framework without having to rewrite all of your application. Writing tests makes changing code a lot easier, because if you can test all of your business application, which is what people care about, and you replace one of the libraries and everything still works, and the stuff people care about is presumably still working. And very subtly, if you think that you're not going to be right making a choice, instead of spending more time on it, spend as little time as possible on it. So 3 scenarios. You're at a company and you've got to decide which library to use for a particular task. Which of these 3 scenarios is going to give the best result? 1, a committee of 5 people spending a week evaluating libraries. Option 2, 1 person spending 5 weeks trying to evaluate which library to use. Or option 3, somebody making a decision within 5 minutes and then spending 5 weeks actually using that library, integrating it, see what its limitations are, see what it feels like. For me, at least, almost all of the time, just getting on with the task and doing a proof of concept is going to be the right choice. And this is something I think is true in a lot of software development, that in carpentry you measure twice and cut once, but this is software. There's no limitation on how many cuts you can make apart from time. So just cut as fast as possible until you run out of time. We're out of time.